How is everybody doing? And welcome back for another Strength Chat episode. Today, I have got a very special guest for you all. I last spoke to this guy in episode 107, a really popular episode with you all. Today, I'm joined by the Barbell Physio, Zach Long. How are you doing?
I'm great, man. Thanks for having me back. Enjoyed our last chat.
Awesome. Yeah, no worries at all. Thanks a lot for taking the time to jump on. How are you? What's been happening in your world recently?
I got a little 4-month-old. So as you know, we've been playing email tag back and forth for about 5 months, trying to figure out when we could do this again. That's kind of been all consuming.
And I was all right because you moved as well during that time as well. Is that right as well?
Yeah, we moved about 20 minutes away from where we were, just out to the suburbs, be a little closer to the in-laws to get a little assistance.
Okay, yeah. I was in my head. I was thinking it was like a bigger distance, having a 4-month-old as well. So a lot of things to, a lot of things to keep you busy. And how was everything? Because obviously, I think when we last spoke, it was sort of around COVID, and everything was a little bit unsure. How has everything sort of progressed since then in terms of the coaching and the content that you've been putting out?
Everything's been great. I mean, I hate to say this, but like COVID was kind of helpful for me because, I'm a physical therapist treating people in the clinic. And for a decent period of time there, I wasn't treating people in the clinic, which let me shift focus to some of my online stuff that was already out there and kind of get a better handle on that instead of running around doing everything like I now am. But those couple of months where things were a little slower were a little nice for me.
Yeah. Oh, cool. I think from that, and I know it's probably been a while since I've touched on it, but I know things are essentially nearly back to normal. It was an opportunity for a lot of people. Especially having followed your content for some time and really enjoyed the first chat that we had. I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about and this is from speaking with clients over the last couple of weeks, but also coaches as well, mobility and how we incorporate that into our training to essentially get stronger and progress, because we know that plays an important role in getting stronger. And I kind of wanted to touch on what's your process of assessing for mobility and looking for those weak spots and then looking to add that into sessions.
Yeah, so I'll first start by saying, I believe from a mobility perspective, our goal should actually be to do as little as possible, but as much as is necessary to get people into the optimal positions for the movements and sports that they perform. There's a big shift towards, more and more people doing mobility work and putting more information out there, which is great. But I see, I work primarily with CrossFitters, and I see CrossFitters that already have great squat mechanics, but are still constantly working on trying to improve their mobility. And I don't think once you have the ability to do the movements that you want to be able to do with proper form, that you really get any added benefit by adding 10 more degrees of dorsiflexion, 15 more degrees of hip rotation. So I like to say as little as possible, as much as is necessary to get you into better positioning. In terms of figuring out what people need to do, I think you have to start with really analyzing what are the movements that you have issues with, and what are the joint capacity things that you need, and the muscle flexibility things that you need. And that takes actually stopping and thinking through that for different individuals. One of the biggest things I see in athletes when they send me a video of their squat, is a great example of this, is they'll say, dude, my hips feel tight every time I squat. I feel like every time I go in, I need to, hit the pigeon stretch and do some foam rolling prior to squatting. And you look at them squat, and they are super forward torso leaned in the bottom of their squat, going through tons of hip flexion, but they don't get any forward knee motion. And so the squat is all about this continuum between ankle and hip motion. If you don't have a lot of ankle motion, you're going to have to go through more hip flexion to squat down to depth. And so often where people feel tight when they squat may not actually be where they are tight. And so don't just assume that. You got to start actually breaking that stuff down. And then also, on the flip side, I'll see people in that same example that overly sit back in their squat. They don't let their knees come forward at all, that they then think that they have an ankle mobility issue. But when you look at their ankle mobility, it's great. They just don't actually use it in their squat. So we got to look at the movement, see where you move well from, and then kind of break those down by using different tests for each of those areas. so that you actually work on the right area, because that's the biggest thing. You could spend 5 years working on your hip mobility. If you go through more hip flexion in your squat because your ankles suck, you are not going to make any progress on that. And I'm actually pretty shocked at how often like that's the case when people send me videos that they're just on the complete wrong area.
Yeah, I think that's the key thing. I really like that, doing it as often as you can, rather than doing more. And the key thing there is focusing on the right area. Just maybe on a little bit of a tangent on that. When you mentioned there, obviously there's you just type in hip mobility drills, and there's going to be loads of exercises that are going to come up. Do you think that people are sort of guided to focus on the wrong areas, and they end up just doing, well, I just need to do more exercises, but focus on, like you mentioned there, sort of like the pigeon stretch or something like that for the hips, or something else, rather than thinking about, right, okay, what's going to actually be specific to them.
Yeah, so I guess the next component to that is actually when you figure out the areas that need to be focused on to improve the movement pattern that you want. So let's say you realize that, okay, it is my hips that actually need to be addressed. Then you might go and YouTube or go on Instagram and find somebody that's put out hip mobility stuff and start doing these 4 or 5 different exercises. And I think that's another issue people have, is they just start randomly throwing different exercises at it, and they throw the whole kitchen sink at the hip. And I much prefer to try to really dial in the specific things. Once you know the specific area, let's now find the specific stretches that are actually improving your mobility. So let's do a pigeon stretch, or a 90 pails and rails, or let's do some hip internal rotation, whatever it is. Let's do an exercise, and then let's look at how that actually translates to what you care about, and do that for a couple different exercises. And when you follow that test retest model, you actually say, oh, this one exercise, it did 0 for me. So guess what? You just saved yourself a couple minutes from doing that stretch. Now you find one that does help. And what do you want to do with that one that does help? Let's dose it up. And so now we get to where we're kind of formulating a plan that's specific to the area you need it, but also specific to your response to very specific stretches. And that lets you do the minimal dose that's necessary to create the maximal response that you want, so that then you're moving better. You can go squat, and we can start to load it up, and we can actually start to build your strength and your fitness while not doing 30 minutes of mobility. We can narrow that down to the 1, 2, maybe 3 things that have the biggest ROI for you.
Yeah,
would be my preference for most people.
Yeah, definitely. I think the explanation from there, which is why you've influenced me a lot in terms of how I coach my clients and athletes. It doesn't have to be like what you said there. Give it a go, test, retest, rather than, I think there's that sometimes be a mentality of, if there's these stretches or mobility drills, they don't get changed. These are the ones that you just stick with forever, but actually they're not doing anything. Is there maybe a point where that could potentially have negative effects on performance or building strength, because they're not actually adding any benefit to allow them to get better or progress?
You mean in terms of, if somebody already has great mobility, adding more, does that have negatives? I don't know that it necessarily has specific negatives. One example I'll give in a second is powerlifters, but overall, I think for most people training just to generally be physically prepared for life and a little bit fitter, I don't think it hurts anything. But how many of us have an extra 30 minutes every day to do mobility work if it's not actually necessary to improve our performance? And I would just much rather get that done. Let's get to building strength. Let's get to building your aerobic fitness, your anaerobic conditioning. Like, let's get to these other things that I think are going to push your health and fitness forward a lot more.
Yeah. And
in terms of like a power lifter, if we're going like really, really sport specific, I don't want to give a power lifter so much mobility that they can then squat super, super deep, because like in their sports, they need to hit parallel and nothing more. And I want them to get down to parallel, hit this little bit of stiffness right at parallel, so that they get a little stretch reflex coming out of the bottom. So that might be one example where having more mobility might not be helpful for that individual. I am for sure, though, not saying that powerlifters should never stretch. It's just that like a powerlifter is probably not going to see their performance get better if they then go and do, intense yoga 3 days a week and become the most flexible powerlifter in the world. They're probably going to give up a little bit of sport specific adaptations as a result of that.
Yeah, and with the on the flip side of that, with people who like the example that you said at the start of, it's not necessarily their hips, it's their ankles. Will that get to a point where their potential lack of mobility in their ankles, lack of movement in their ankles, will start highlighting of telling them that, look, we're going to have to work on their ankles, or can that potentially just go undetected if they're not swapping things around or doing that test retest? If that kind of makes sense, what I said there.
I didn't quite get that, if you don't mind saying
So
that one
with
again.
the example at the start, obviously we've said about is more mobility going to be detrimental to performance. But the example that you used at the start, people are squatting and they're saying, "Oh, it's my hips that feel really tight," but actually it's going to be the movement that they've got in their ankle. Can it get to a point where if they keep trying to work on their hips, but it's actually the ankles at the problem, that that will start sort of being highlighted in their training as they're progressing? Will that kind of make them or force them to start looking at their ankle mobility?
So I just think that in that situation, if somebody is spinning their wheels, working on their hips, I don't think that they're going to really necessarily open themselves up to like injury or loss of performance. They're just going to notice that they're spending weeks and months working on this one area, and they're not seeing any actual changes in what they feel in their squat or their performance of the squat in that example. And nobody needs to spend months wasting their time stretching on the wrong thing.
Yeah, definitely, because it's just, I'm just using examples of, when you're seeing people, it's kind of like what you mentioned about videos that get sent to you, and having a look from that point of view of, look, actually, we don't want to be wasting time, because like you say, it just means that we've got to do extra mobility or extra things that we're adding in. In terms of incorporating it into an actual program, in terms of the balance, and then also working on sort of the weak links, if things just need to get stronger or we just need to develop certain areas, how do you kind of go around adding that into a program so they still feel as though they're not just stretching or doing foam rolling drills like what we've mentioned, where they actually feel as though they're actually getting some training done, if that kind of makes sense?
Okay. So a couple different layers to that. I'm going to start with just my general 3 steps that I like anytime I'm programming mobility for somebody. I like to incorporate at least 2 of these 3 things, typically all 3 if I'm writing a mobility program. Number 1 is we need something that opens up that range of motion. So that could be doing a little bit of foam rolling, which will temporarily open up some motion. That could be doing some static stretching. That could be doing some loaded eccentric, something that opens up mobility. Number 2, I want to isolate it. So kind of once we open up some new mobility, I feel like if we build a little bit of strength in those new ranges of motion, people are going to keep that a little bit more. So if you look at the research on static stretching, you'll see that people get a little bit more flexible when they static stretch, and then they lose a little bit of that, and they get a little bit and lose a little bit. And I feel like if we static stretch and combine that with some in-range strength in that new range of motion, we see a little less of that loss between sessions. And then finally, we want to integrate that. So that might be that after we do ankle mobility work, we just go and squat, or it could be that we're doing specific squats where we're really focusing on using more of that range of motion that we just opened up. Or if somebody, when they overhead press from stiff shoulders, overextends their back, we might want to do something like an anti-extension press where we're working on their core strength as they press overhead to work on a bit better bracing strategy and not compensating like that. So I like to have those 3 components in it. And those 3 components are not always necessarily like 3 different exercises. Yeah. So if we're looking at like somebody's hamstring flexibility, we can open, isolate, and integrate by doing an eccentric Romanian deadlift, where we stretch the hamstrings at the same time that we build strength at in range and through the full range, and we integrate it into a pattern. But if we're just doing like static stretching, if I'm just stretching your ankles, then I probably want to do something like a goblet squat afterwards, where we're really emphasizing driving the knees forward and taking advantage of the fact that we just opened them. So I want to see kind of those 3 components in there somewhere. Yeah. Then what I like to do, because I just think this stuff is often quite boring to do, I most often like to program my mobility work as part of somebody's warm-up, where we're going to take a couple of these active mobility exercises and combine them with other exercises for whatever body region we're working. And we just turn that into like an EMOM or an AMRAP for 8 to 10 minutes. That way we get warmed up at the same time that we get this stuff out of the way. So let's say we're working on that ankle mobility. Maybe we do some like banded ankle joint mobility work for a minute or two. And then we jump into like a quick little like 6 to 8 minute AMRAP, meaning as many rounds as possible, or EMOM, every minute on the minute, for anybody that's not familiar with those terms. We hit goblet squats, and we hit, so goblet squats, we're now integrating that movement pattern. Maybe it's a full body day, so we do goblet squats, some kettlebell swings, some kettlebell overhead presses. And now we get a little bit of everything warmed up while we're still opening some range of motion first, integrating it. We get warmed up. Now we go do our squats and our actual fitness-based stuff. But it lets us get 2 birds with 1 stone if we can warm up and get the mobility work done at the same time.
Yeah, definitely. I think the probably the thing I'm taking from that is it's probably a little bit more of an efficient way of doing it, because when people come into the gym, which I'm a big believer in, that people want to come in and they want to get to the point where they're throwing some barbells around, or they're doing the more interesting stuff. Do you think that's where sometimes, or do you think that's where coaches and trainers and physical therapists sort of maybe are a little bit scared about trying those things, and they want to, like, because if they have it as a separate exercise, just doing one thing, they concentrate on a little bit more, where rather than what you're saying there in terms of the AMRAPs and the EMOMs, as a warm-up, they're not going to injure themselves, they're not going to do it wrong, because it's still controlled. Do you think that that's where maybe some trainers can struggle with that in terms of programming?
Struggle with like combining that together and not keeping them all separate? Yeah. And I think that, like you said, it just becomes a little bit less of an efficient workout. People that are busy and coming to see you as a personal trainer or coach or physical therapist, like, they've got a lot going on in their life. So anytime we can kind of condense this fitness dosage for them and get them in, get them sweating, get their heart rate up, build strength, like the more quickly we can get through that stuff, the more they're going to enjoy it and like it and be compliant with that stuff.
Yeah, definitely, because that's the thing that you mentioned there at the end. Obviously, being compliant with it. The only way that we're going to get better at things is staying consistent with it and actually getting buy into it. Do you think, or have you seen that probably more people gravitating more towards that to become a little bit more efficient, get that done early, and then get into training?
Yeah, so I know, at least I talk a little bit more to physical therapists than I probably do strength coaches right now. The EMOM movement. So I got to give credit to my friend Mitch Babcock, who kind of came up with this idea of incorporating EMOMs into our mobility work and warm-ups and physical therapy exercises, is catching on quite a bit in that world for sure. Because mobility work is boring, but what's more boring than mobility work is traditional physical therapy exercises, where you have to, isolate the very specific muscles that are weak or painful. And like, nobody wants to really do like banded shoulder external rotations at 90 degrees. Like, we want to pick up barbells and slam them on the ground. So that stuff's really, really boring. And it becomes a little bit more fun when you turn that into an EMOM or an AMRAP that makes that CrossFitter or that powerlifter start to look at this. And it kind of looks a little bit more like structured training than it does like physical therapy.
Yeah, definitely, because that's the thing as well, making it look and feel like training. Do you think, just building on that as well, having that in, because I know we mentioned before about that retest using the same exercises. Is there a time or a thought process of progressing those AMRAPs and progressing those EMOMs? Like, how far would you go with that before, I don't know, it turns into the exercise? Or would you actually take anything away if it's not needed to keep that efficiency?
So the way I typically program this is I want it to look like structured training. So we are going to try to get more work done in that amount of time, most workouts. So that might be in that EMOM, you're working for a certain period of time, or you're doing a certain number of reps or certain number of weights. I want that to be progressively overloaded over time. And as long as all of the movements in there are contributing towards what our goal is, I'm going to keep them in and just try to progressively overload. Now, certainly there are going to be times where, maybe after a little while of doing this AMRAP, EMOM, whatever we have programmed for you here, we've taken care of that ankle mobility. Great. Now we start to build that for the next highest priority area. Like, maybe we prioritize for a month your ankles, and now that those have cleared up a little bit, maybe now we know that we got to work on your thoracic spine mobility. So now we just update that EMOM that you're using for your workout to be more specific on the next highest up area. Yeah. But I do want it to be pretty much progressively overloaded is our goal still.
because why I touch on that is that, you know, sometimes when you look at the exercises, obviously with anything can be progressed, and in terms of like the end goal, is it a case of we don't want to start progressing too soon, because then what's beyond that point? Do you think sometimes in terms of progressing it, that the physical therapists sometimes hold back a little bit, or start at the top and then they have nowhere else to progress because they've thrown everything at it already, if that makes sense?
I'll be honest, the vast majority of physical therapists out there are not overdosing exercise, they are underdosing exercise. They're doing too light of stuff to create adaptive changes in the human body. So it's rare that you're going to find a PT that overdoses. They may overdose volume. So what they might do is you might have somebody come into you as a strength coach, and they're talking to you about, hey, I've had this shoulder issue going on for a while. I'm seeing a physical therapist. You start to dive into what they're doing, and they pull out the exercise sheet the PT gave them. They got 10 exercises that they're doing. That to me is somebody that's probably overdosing the volume and hasn't really narrowed it down to the specific things that person needs at the right appropriate dose. I feel like most of the time for my physical therapy clients, you know, it's going to take 2, 3, maybe 4 exercises total for most things to get a high enough dose to help work through that issue. Now that might be different than like if I'm treating a post-op ACL. Like with that post-op ACL, I am writing them a full-on strength program that they're hitting 3 days a week for 60 minutes, that have squats and lunges and rear foot elevated split squats and blah, 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 blah. That exercise program is going to look different. But like if somebody comes to you with rotator cuff tendinopathy and their list of exercises is 10 long, that is most likely a physical therapist that hasn't dialed in the exercise dosage good enough. Yeah. But it's rare that PTs are starting out so aggressive on their loading for something that they are going to overtrain that individual. Most of the time, we're a little too scared of dosing up and building fitness in individuals.
Yeah. And from obviously, you know, I was chatting now. Why do you think that is? Do you think it's a knowledge? Do you think it's a confidence thing and an experience thing? What sort of the why do you think the reason is behind that?
I think overall, I'm trying to be careful with my words here. We definitely don't get a good enough knowledge of strength in physical therapy school to appropriately dose exercise. And you don't very often talk about more complex compound movements. So we'll talk about your rotator cuff tendinopathy and you know, strengthening the posterior cuff with shoulder external rotation drills, but we don't ever take that to analyzing somebody's overhead press. Or we talk about somebody's back pain, and we talk about pain with lifting stuff, and they'll talk about different lifting techniques, but it's always discussed like lifting a golf ball out of a golf hole or picking your kid up, never talking about how do we lift a barbell. And you know, if you could teach somebody to lift a barbell and show them how to do that without pain with some load on bar, then teaching them to do that lower level stuff is so easy. So I'd much rather would like to teach people how to do this high level stuff, because we can so easily scale that down to other movements. And I think that's what we're lacking in a lot of, at least on this side of the world. In America, we're definitely lacking a lot of that inside of our schools.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because obviously if they're shown how exactly, you know, completely agree. If they're shown how to use a barbell, then it doesn't become this, from a client's point of view, this daunting thing of, oh my God, if I do this, I'm gonna hurt myself or anything like that, or I'm not going to be able to do it. In terms of like when you mentioned there about, you know, overhead pressing and the barbell exercises, in terms of adjusting those exercises, sometimes if there are niggles or weak points, how much would you, because there's always that thought process of you can change the range of movement, change the piece of equipment, or, you know, there's another train of thought which is, well, just make it lighter, still do that exercise, but just do it lighter until it's pain-free. What's kind of your approach when it comes to when you're working with, you know, the CrossFit athletes or powerlifters or anyone who's doing sort of the barbell work, to make sure that, similar to the mobility side of things, they're still getting that training when they're in the gym, they still feel like they're working?
Yeah. So I think for sure we want to try to maximize or minimize the loss of fitness. Like we want to keep people working towards their health and fitness goals. We don't want them to just rest. So the next step becomes like, what's the tissue kind of generating those symptoms? Because most tissues, if we're talking like a tendinopathy, if we're talking a muscle strain, things like that are 100% fine to load with discomfort. Now, if we're talking like, dude, I'm having 8 out of 10 pain when I do hamstring curls after I strain my hamstring, do we want to continue doing hamstring curls that create that much pain? No, we need to dose down our exercise. But for most of those, it is okay and actually good to load with discomfort, because that is going to help promote that tissue healing. If you want to know more about that, Jill Cook's research is probably the person to go dive into on that. If on the flip side, we're talking about like a stress fracture on a runner that comes to see you, a stress fracture, we do not load with pain, period. So we got to know kind of what the tissue generating those symptoms is first, because even discomfort on a stress fracture is generally going to be considered a stoplight. So that's identify the tissue. But then, then the next thing is, if it's a tissue that we're fine to load, I want to maintain their fitness dose as close as possible to what they should be doing as I can. And then there's going to be a lot of different tactics, like you just mentioned, to do that. So maybe somebody's just not tolerating loads over 75%. Well, great. Let's lift loads lighter than that. We're going to up our volume, our reps. We're going to be a little bit more focused on high volume GPP or hypertrophy work than we are on our max strength, but that's fine. We do that for a period of time. And then we have those bigger muscles that we can then transition to a strength phase if we really know how to program appropriately. Or maybe we, like you said, also reduce the range of motion here. So maybe you have pain pulling from the ground and you can't deadlift from the ground. Great, let's do some rack pulls. If those aren't significantly aggravating your symptoms, we can still strengthen that general movement pattern while understanding kind of some of the limitations that you have based on your current symptomology. But I think far too often the obvious immediate response is let's rest, or let's just completely avoid that movement. And that's unfortunate, because we've worked our butts off to gain fitness. And I don't want you to lose that fitness during this 6-week period where you're having a little back pain, a little knee pain, whatever it is.
Yeah. And with that, because the how you started that, which I think is well, it might end up a rabbit hole of other topics on this, but the obviously minimizing the pain and going up to that threshold as much as it is pain. Is it kind of to be accepted? Because obviously sometimes there's that thought process of, if it hurts, I'm going to stop doing that. But if we have niggles or injuries, and we're still wanting to, maintain that strength, maintain that fitness, is that to be expected? And then is it a case of, okay, so how much pain can we tolerate? Is that something that you kind of look at or discuss with your clients and athletes?
So anytime we train, we kind of have this balance between pushing our volume and intensity up to push our fitness forward and our ability to recover from that. So you could work out really easily, never really push that volume or intensity, and your risk of getting injured is going to be pretty low. But also your reward of health and fitness gains is going to be really low as well. So you're not going to build any fitness. If you're pushing volume and intensity and progressively loading that over time, I do believe that it's pretty much unavoidable that you are going to occasionally have an injury. And most of the time, those are just going to be minor injuries that are small blips in the road that we then need to work on training around a little bit more. So out of the tendinopathy research, so I mentioned Jill Cook is one great researcher in that area a minute ago. There's another one, Silbernagel. I believe Silbernagel's first name is Karen, but I might be wrong about that. But there is the Silbernagel, Silbernagel, is I think how that's spelled, Silbernagel pain monitoring model. And that's something that I use quite a bit with my patients and athletes in terms of understanding the appropriate levels of us dosing exercise. I typically use this with people dealing with tendinopathies and muscle strains, but it's a red light, yellow light, green light analogy. Red light, pain greater than 5 out of 10. We stop exercising. That's where we need to modify stuff a little bit more. Green light, 0 to 2. Green light, we continue to go. It is okay to exercise with discomfort. And then you have those in-betweens that are like a 3 and a 4, a little bit more than discomfort, not really sharp pain, probably doesn't really change how you move, but it's one of those where when you start doing it, you're like, I don't know if I should actually continue or not. And what they say in the pain monitoring model is then when they're that yellow light, think of driving through, do y'all have red light, yellow light, green light? on
Yeah.
that side of the world? Okay, good. So when I drive through a yellow light, the first thing I do is look in my rearview mirror and see if I'm going to get pulled over by a cop for going a little too aggressively there. So if you hit a yellow light in your workout and you're dealing with a little tendinopathy, then your rear view mirror is monitoring how you respond to that load, that dosage over the next 24 hours. So let's say you're dealing with like some patellar tendinopathy, some knee tendon pain. You go into a squat workout, it's a 3 or 4 out of 10. You decide to continue going because that's a yellow light. Tomorrow morning, you're walking down the stairs when you wake up. And today your knee didn't really bother you going downstairs. Tomorrow morning, it's like a 3 out of 10 on the way down. So your 24-hour response is that 24 hours later, you're still a little bit elevated from that workout. That means that workout was a little too much and that tendon hasn't quite recovered from it. And so, next time squats show up, I was close to having it dialed in right because it wasn't that painful, but I got that 24-hour feedback. So we dropped down the volume or the intensity just enough that then the next day we've kind of recovered, and we hit that for a few workouts and then we start to slowly build it back up. But that kind of gives you some guide rails there for what's too aggressive in terms of your loading or what's maybe not aggressive enough.
Yeah, I think it's always good to have that spectrum of when to push it and when to pull back a little bit. And it goes back to, again, what you mentioned earlier about that test retest. I suppose that is part of that, because rather than just I think sometimes, and it'd be good to hear your thoughts on this, is that it's too reactive. Judgments are made too quick in terms of, oh, was that hurting? Or it hurt the next day. Oh no, let's just stop that, rather than being like, right, okay, well, when did it was hurting the next day? Like what you say, you can adjust the training from there.
What I really like about it is, as a physical therapist, I don't want to be the person that says, no, you can't do this. Instead, that lets me say, look, these are just our general guidelines. I'm fine with you doing and testing whatever you want. And there are going to be times where you hit a red light. There are going to be times where you hit a yellow light and get that bad 24-hour response. That's fine. It's all about us finding the upper limits of what you can handle. And then we back down to what your body responds to well and progress. But it's not me saying you can't do this, you can't do that. It's us saying we have to follow this model so that we know what your body's responding to. And your body is telling us what we can and can't do right now. And as long as we're continually respecting that, we're going to allow those tissues to heal up. And we're also still, because we're still loading those tissues, we're going to still be getting them stronger and building their fitness up right now, versus just simply resting.
Yeah. Do you think with that, because confidence in the gym, especially when there's niggles or bumps in the roads, like what you mentioned, when people get injuries or setbacks, I think confidence is a big thing. Do you think by explaining it like how you've mentioned there, it builds more trust and more of a relationship and sort of more of a teamwork, rather than, nope, can't do this, nope, you can't do that, and gives them the confidence and trust in you as a physical therapist?
I love the teamwork, but I think what it does is it gives themselves more trust in their own body and their own body's resilience, and it gets them focusing on the things that they can and can't control. And then they start to understand a little bit better how to dose their own exercise rather than having somebody else always tell them what to do. I want my patients to have the tools themselves to manage this. And I am not your, I'm just your guide. I'm your coach. I'm here to assist you, but you're going to get it done yourself. I'm just going to help speed you getting up. I would rather them have that autonomy.
Definitely. And it goes back to kind of full circle, like what we said at the start, rather than people spinning the wheels, just being more efficient and having somebody there to be like, right, this is the direction that we're going. This is the, like what you say, these are the guidelines that we're going to work on. But they're the ones that are going to do it at the end of the day. They need to understand their body. Thanks a lot, Zach, for taking time to jump on. A few tangents and topics thrown in there. The last question that I like to ask, from everything that we've chatted about there, what would be your take-home points or words of wisdom?
I think my take-home points is always, whether you're talking about rehabbing an injury or you're talking about pushing your performance forward, just take the time to do a solid self-assessment of what's going on with yourself or your own athletes. Because taking the time to do that is going to set you up for a much better game plan, whether it's, talking about your rehab with a tendinopathy and understanding that we got to load those tendons up and know our markers there, or improving our mobility or improving our strength. Like it's all about figuring out what are the areas that are holding you back and then planning out the attack plan after you've done that, not just throwing together a random plan to get stuff better.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of summing up what we chatted about there. Yeah, again, thanks a lot I really enjoyed chatting with you the first time. Really appreciate you jumping back on today. If anyone has any questions about what we've chatted about today, see the content that you put out there, where could people find you or reach out to you?
Oh, you can find my contact information on either of my websites. So there's thebarbellphysio.com and there's also performanceplusprogramming.com. Since we talked so much about analyzing your own mobility, if you also go to performanceplusprogramming.com/ultimate-mobility-checklist, I got a free resource there that basically you look at most movement patterns that fitness athletes are doing. You got back squat, front squat, overhead press, pull-ups. You click that movement and it will show you the tests that you need to do. If you're struggling with your overhead mobility, it'll show you what are the 3 or 4 tests you need to do to actually identify the specific area you need to work on.
I hope everyone noted that down, but don't worry, I'll put it in the show notes. Don't worry. No, really appreciate that, Zach. Like I say, some really good, useful content that people can use, and like I say, we can be more efficient and not be worried about spending ages and a long time doing things and just spinning our wheels like what we mentioned at the start. So yeah, thanks a lot for taking the time to jump on. Thanks a lot to everyone listening, and I will catch up with you all next week.